In this introduction to the E-module, we're going to talk about what a transboundary crisis is and why it is important. Let's first get to a definition. A transboundary crisis is a crisis type. So we have a whole spectrum of crises, and transboundary crises are a particular type of crisis, and what sets them apart is that they cross boundaries. There could be geographical boundaries, like country boundaries, or policy system boundaries, different policy systems, or even governance levels. And many examples of crisis can be described on this dimension of how transboundary they are. So what are the characteristics of a transboundary crisis? We have 5 characteristics. One, obviously, is that there are multiple sectors or multiple countries involved. The second characteristic of a transboundary crisis is that there's usually a long lead-up time to these crises. We call them creeping crises that suddenly escalate, so they're harder to trace in time. And all that makes them harder to comprehend because they originate in a different sector or in a different country, evolve over time. The causes and consequences are hard to understand. Brings us to the fourth characteristic, which is the lack of ownership. A transboundary crisis doesn't fall precisely within one of the bureaucratic boundaries that we've drawn up for other complex problems. And that means it's not always clear who should be in the lead during these crises. And the fifth, and in this particular project, final characteristic is that there's no ready solution. So sometimes we don't even know how to talk about solutions because they're so unique and so complex. These characteristics make a transboundary crisis very hard to manage. And if you think about it, the causes are so complex and so hard to comprehend that makes it impossible to prevent these crises from happening. They're also hard to detect because they emerge over time and in different systems. So they often come as a surprise. And when they finally hit, and because you don't know where they come from, they're also hard to understand because they have their own dynamics. And because the ownership is not clear as who has to make the decisions, who does the communication, and who in the end should be accountable for these crises. So if you take these characteristics and these challenges, it becomes clear that the systems we have to manage all kinds of disasters or incidents or crises that are not transboundary are not fit for these particular challenges. And that brings us to the European Union. We could say, why does the European Union need to invest in transboundary crisis management capacities? Well, first of all, if we accept that these crises will happen and that the systems that are nation-based are not sufficient or not capable to deal with these crises. And then if we add to that the consequences can be so severe that the legitimacy of our public institutions would decline rapidly if government cannot provide a solution for these crises, then we would almost have to look at some sort of transboundary level, if you will, of solutions. And there's really one organization that has been busy investing in transboundary capacities to deal with transboundary challenges, and that's the European Union. And that's why we look at the European Union to see if those capacities are also useful to manage transboundary crises. If we want to study transboundary crisis management capacities, we should start thinking about, what is crisis management? What kind of capacities would we need for a transboundary crisis? And we have drawn from the crisis management literature 7 tasks, if you will. So if we unpack crisis management, we go into 7 tasks that are all very useful if you want to produce an effective response. And you will see those on the slide. They're detection of crisis, the information sharing between actors, we call that sense making, coordination, making institutions collaborate, defining authority, who makes those decisions, overcoming the implementation hurdles, making something happen during a crisis, communicating with different audiences, and then making this whole thing accountable afterwards. So these are the challenges. Now, if we want to assess transboundary crisis management, something we're going to be doing in this project and that we're reporting on in this E-module, we say these tasks matter. And we want to study the capacities, the specific capacities that could be used to fulfill any of these tasks. And that's what we're doing in this project. We're looking at the different institutions, the different agencies, both at the national level and the EU level, to see which capacities could be used and have been used by leaders, by institutions, to fulfill these tasks. And by looking at leaders and by looking at actual crisis, we have generated findings. And these are the findings we're going to be talking about in this module.